The heavy oak door of the Alpha King's study stood open by a mere fraction of an inch. A sliver of warm, flickering candlelight spilled out into the freezing stone corridor of the Valdris winter fortress. Downstairs, the solstice ceremony banquet roared with laughter, clinking goblets, and the thumping rhythm of the Pax celebration. The noise echoed up the grand staircase like a distant tide. Seraphina Vance stood in the shadows of the hallway, entirely removed from the joy below. Her breath formed faint, white plumes in the drafty corridor. She had come to fetch her husband. The grand feast required the presence of both the Alpha King and his Luna, but her footsteps halted when she caught the scent drifting through that narrow gap in the doorway. It was Kaelin's scent, sharp pine, ozone, and the crackling static of an approaching thunderstorm. Yet it was wrong. The natural, wild edge of his aura felt muffled, wrapped tightly in something cloying and artificial. It smelled like crushed moonshade petals, a sickly sweet aroma that made the back of Seraphina's throat burn. She didn't know it was the Luna elixir. She didn't know it was a slow, insidious poison designed to cloud the primal instincts of a wolf. And she definitely didn't know that the man speaking inside that room was operating under a chemically induced fog. All she knew was the sudden, violent drop in temperature radiating from the golden thread of their mate bond. "The council is growing impatient, Kaelin," a woman's voice murmured. Seraphina's lungs seized. It was Lady Victoria. The antagonist's tone was smooth, coated in honey, and calculated reverence. Victoria Sterling had always positioned herself near the throne, a constant, irritating shadow wrapped in silk and political ambition. Her scent, heavy jasmine and expensive powder, clashed violently with Kaelin's stifled aura. "They look to the dais, and they see a weak placeholder," Victoria continued, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor of the study. "Seraphina is quiet. She is fragile, and more importantly, my king, she is barren, 5 years, Kaelin. Valdris needs the heir. The pack needs a true queen, not a stray you took pity on." Silence, a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the corridor. Seraphina waited for the growl. She waited for the terrifying, room-shaking snarl of the Alpha King defending his chosen mate. She waited for the bond in her chest to flare with Kaelin's protective fury, the molten gold heat that always accompanied his rage. He was a man who had once threatened to break a general's jaw just for looking at her too long. He was the king who had claimed her when no one else would. But the silence stretched. The golden thread connecting her soul to his felt strangely hollow, like a river of liquid silver suddenly turned to solid, dead ice. The sudden absence of his fierce protection was a physical weight pressing down on her sternum. Then Kaelin spoke. "The royal decree is already drafted on my desk." His voice was a detached, emotionless rumble. It lacked the resonant depth of his usual tone. It sounded mechanical, empty. "I have signed it," Kaelin, Drake continued. The scratching of a quill against thick parchment echoed through the crack in the door. Seraphina was a temporary measure, a necessity to calm the elders during the transition of power, but she cannot carry the bloodline. She cannot hold the primal magic of this territory. "You will take the Luna Queen throne, Victoria. The royal ancestral band will be transferred to your hand before the next moon cycle." The words hit Seraphina with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. A temporary measure, a placeholder. She didn't gasp, she didn't stumble backward. Her body simply went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The physiological reaction of a rejected mate was supposed to be chaotic. A violent tearing of the soul, a hysterical breakdown of the inner wolf. Yet Seraphina's wolf did not howl. It retreated into the deepest, darkest corner of her mind and curled into a ball of silent frost. The blood drained from her face, pooling in her core as her body shifted into a primal state of shock. "You are making the right choice for the Empire," Victoria purred, the sound accompanied by the rustling of heavy parchment. The royal decree document being folded, the sealing of Seraphina's fate. "She will be adequately compensated, I assume. A small estate in the outer territories, perhaps. She will be dealt with quietly," the king replied, his tone devoid of any affection, any memory of the nights he had spent whispering promises into Seraphina's hair. The pack must not see hesitation. He spoke of her as if she were a miscalculated tax ledger, a minor inconvenience to be swept away before dawn. The cold seeped through the cracks in the stone floor, travelling up the soles of Seraphina's thin velvet slippers, freezing her blood in her veins. Her fingertips went entirely numb. The bond in her chest, that beautiful, glowing tether that had once pulsed with Kaelin's heartbeat, shriveled into a tight, agonizing knot. She could have pushed the door open. She could have burst into the study, demanding an explanation, screaming at the injustice, begging the man she loved to look at her and remember. She could have thrown herself at his feet and pleaded for her position, for her dignity, for the scraps of his affection. She could have wept until he felt the salt water on his own cheeks through the bond. Instead, Seraphina did nothing of the sort. She kept her head bowed and her back straight, her hands hidden in the folds of her silver gown, curled into tight fists. Her fingernails bit into her palms until the skin threatened to break, grounding her in the sharp, clean sensation of physical pain. She controlled her breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4. She forced her heart rate to slow, refusing to let her distress spike the pheromones in the hallway. If Kaelin's senses weren't so clouded by the lunar elixir, he might have felt the exact moment his mate's soul slammed its doors shut, not used, not owned, chosen. That was what he had whispered to her on their wedding night. It had all been a meticulously crafted lie. Seraphina looked at the sliver of light spilling from the study. She did not shed a single tear. Her eyes, a quiet storm-glass grey, hardened into glacial ice. She executed a slow, flawless, completely silent curtsy to the empty hallway, a final, mocking tribute to a king who had just thrown away his greatest asset. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. The sound of the banquet continued to echo up the grand staircase. Laughter, music, the clinking of glasses celebrating the solstice. Seraphina moved like a ghost through the corridors of Valdris, her steps completely silent. The warmth of the fortress felt foreign now, repulsive against her skin. She reached the heavy mahogany doors of the royal bedchamber. They yielded without a sound. The room she had shared with Kaelin for 5 years was vast and opulent. The massive hearth crackled with a roaring fire, casting a golden glow over the furs, the tapestries, and the silk sheets that still carried the imprint of their bodies from the night before. The scent of pine and cedar was overwhelming here. It was the scent of a sanctuary that had just been reclassified as a cage. Seraphina moved with clinical precision. There was no frantic rushing, no hysterical throwing of garments. She pulled a single, modest leather travelling bag from the bottom of a cedar chest. She did not pack the jewels Kaelin had gifted her. She did not take the fine silks, the velvet gowns, or the intricate hairpins meant for a queen. She packed only the absolute necessities: 3 sets of durable, woven wool clothing, a hunting knife, a flint, and a small pouch of medicinal herbs she had gathered herself from the northern woods. Her movements were steady. The air in the room felt suffocatingly thick, yet her lungs drew it in with mechanical rhythm. She walked to the vanity. The polished mirror reflected a woman who looked far too calm for the devastation occurring inside her chest. She reached up and unpinned the intricate silver braids of her hair. Then she reached toward the collar of her gown. Her fingers brushed against the thick silver chain resting over her collarbone. She unclasped it, pulling free her old pack token, the heavy, moon-crested emblem of Valdris that Kaelin had placed around her neck on the day he claimed her. The metal was still warm from her skin. She set the old pack token on the vanity, the quiet clink of silver against cold marble finalizing her surrender of the territory. Next, her hands moved to the lunar crown resting on her head. It was a delicate circlet of forged, starlight steel, cold and heavy with the history of the Valdris pack. Seraphina lifted it off her skull. The weight leaving her head felt strangely like a physical liberation. She carried the crown to the center of the massive marital bed and set it down precisely on the pristine white covers. Finally, she looked at her left hand. The wedding ring, a band of simple, unadorned silver that matched Kaelin's own. It felt like a shackle burning against her skin. She twisted it past her knuckle. The metal scraped against her bone, a tiny, sharp sting that barely registered against the hollow ache in her chest. She placed the ring directly inside the center of the lunar crown, a perfect, silent resignation. But there was one final tie to sever. The pack mind link. It was the psychic network that connected every wolf in Valdris to their Alpha King. It was a constant, low-level hum of belonging, a protective blanket of shared consciousness. To break it voluntarily was considered a form of self-mutilation. It was an excruciating process that most Omegas and lower-ranking wolves could not survive without losing their sanity. It was the absolute, final declaration of a rogue. Seraphina closed her eyes. She stood perfectly still in the center of the room. She reached inward, past the frozen knot of her mate bond, past the shivering form of her inner wolf, and grabbed hold of the psychic tether that linked her to Kaelin's domain. She didn't gently untie it. She ripped it. The pain was immediate and blinding. It felt like a serrated blade tearing through the soft tissue of her brain. A silent, psychic scream echoed in the hollow cavern of her skull as the connection snapped in a spray of mental static. Blood rushed to her ears, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing. Her knees buckled for a fraction of a second, hitting the thick rug, but she instantly forced herself back up to her feet. She locked her jaw so tightly she tasted the metallic tang of blood on her tongue. The agony was a living thing, clawing at the inside of her skull, demanding she cry out, demanding she seek the Alpha to repair the damage. She would not cry out. She would not let the guards outside the corridor hear a single sound. When the agony finally subsided into a dull, throbbing ache, the silence in her mind was absolute. The comforting hum of the pack was gone. She was completely, utterly alone. A rogue, a ghost in her own home. Seraphina walked to the heavy oak wardrobe and pulled out a thick, weather-beaten traveling cloak. It was the cloak she had worn before Kaelin had found her, before he had draped her in the luxury of the Valdris court. She swung it over her shoulders, the coarse wool rough and grounding against her skin. She pulled the deep hood up, shadowing her face. She looked at the ornate writing desk near the window, the inkwell, the fresh parchment, the quill. She could have written a letter. She could have left a scathing condemnation of his betrayal, a list of her grievances, a final plea for him to realize what he was doing. She could have told him about the subtle, dangerous shifts she had noticed in Lady Victoria's behavior, because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome. Explaining herself to a man who had already signed her away was an insult to her own dignity. Let him find the empty room. Let him find the crown and the ring. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king. And his silence tonight had grown fangs that had bitten right through her heart. Seraphina turned her back on the desk. She turned her back on the bed, the fire, and the scent of pine and ozone. She opened the glass balcony doors. The howling fury of the winter storm instantly invaded the room, extinguishing the fire in the hearth with a violent gust of freezing wind. The brutal cold slapped her face, stinging her cheeks, but she welcomed it. The physical bite of the blizzard was far kinder than the coldness of Kaelin's voice in the study. She stepped out onto the stone balcony. The fortress was built into the side of a massive mountain, and the drop below was perilous, but Seraphina knew the hidden paths. She had spent hours memorizing the ancient architecture of Valdris, mapping the blind spots of the elite guard. She hoisted her small leather bag over her shoulder and swung herself over the stone balustrade. The descent was treacherous. The stones were slick with black ice, and the wind tore at her cloak, threatening to peel her off the wall and send her plummeting into the abyss below. Her fingers, already numb from the cold, clamped onto the frozen ledges with desperate, unyielding strength. Every muscle in her arms screamed in protest, but she did not stop. She moved with the silent, desperate agility of a predator escaping a trap. She navigated the perilous vertical drop, trusting her muscle memory, more than her failing eyesight in the blinding snow. When her boots finally hit the snow-covered ground of the outer courtyard, she did not pause to catch her breath. The blizzard was her ally. The heavy, driving snow would cover her tracks within minutes. The freezing wind would tear her scent from the air. scattering it into the void before Kaelin's border patrols could even register her presence. Seraphina slipped through the shadows of the outer wall, bypassing the main gates entirely. She found the old, rusted iron grate covering the drainage tunnel that led out into the frozen wilderness. With a surge of adrenaline, she hauled the heavy iron aside, squeezed through the narrow opening, and pulled the grate back into place behind her. She emerged on the other side of the fortress walls. The endless, untamed expanse of the northern wastes stretched out before her, a chaotic sea of white and grey. The wind howled like a chorus of dying wolves. She did not look back at the towering spires of the Valdris fortress. She did not look back at the warm, glowing windows of the banquet hall, where her husband was celebrating with the woman who would replace her. She simply lowered her head against the wind and began to walk. The hours bled into one another as she marched deeper into the wilderness, crossing the invisible outer boundaries of the Valdris territory. The storm did not relent. If anything, the temperature plummeted further, turning the air into tiny, invisible shards of glass that shredded her lungs with every inhale. The cold was absolute, predatory. It sank its invisible teeth through the thick wool of her cloak, attacking the heat of her skin. Within the first mile, her toes lost all sensation, the numbness creeping rapidly up her calves until her legs felt like heavy, wooden stumps. Every step became a monumental, agonizing effort. The sensory deprivation of the blizzard, the blinding whiteout, the deafening roar of the wind, forced her to rely entirely on the primal instincts she had kept suppressed for years. Her eyelashes froze together in clumps of ice, sealing her vision in terrifying intervals until she forced them apart again. Her lips cracked, tasting strongly of copper and salt. Her mind, desperate for a reprieve from the torture, cruelly supplied her with memories of warmth. She remembered the massive stone hearth in Kaelin's chambers. She remembered how, on winter nights precisely like this one, his massive arms would pull her against his chest. His body heat would radiate through the golden thread of their bond, a furnace of pure, protective energy keeping the frost at bay. His scent of sharp pine and ozone would envelop her, rendering the brutal northern winters entirely harmless. Now that golden thread was nothing but a dead, frozen cord in her chest, heavy and hollow. There was no heat, there was no sanctuary. There was only the bitter, slicing wind tearing at her hood and the relentless, mechanical crunch of her boots breaking through the endless crust of the snow. She knew the territory of Valdris ended at the jagged northern peaks of the borderlands. Beyond the frozen peaks lay the neutral zone, and further north, the brutal, unforgiving domain of the northern wolves. Alpha Garrick Thorne ruled there, a man known for his ruthless honor and his deep ancestral hatred for Kaelin Drake. It was the one place Kaelin's guards would not dare to search. It was a suicide mission for a lone, weakened female to cross the frozen borderlands in the dead of winter. Seraphina was not just a weak placeholder. She was not the fragile Baron Omega Victoria had claimed her to be. Deep within her veins, buried under layers of suppression and fear, lay a dormant truth. An ancient bloodline that did not answer to the moon goddess, but to something far older, something that thrived in the cold. As she reached the foothills of the jagged peaks, the snow deepened, burying the landscape in treacherous drifts. Her legs felt like lead. The sheer exertion of pushing through the storm was draining her rapidly. The dull ache in her mind where the packlink had been severed throbbed with a renewed, vicious intensity, a phantom limb crying out for connection. She stumbled, her knee hitting a jagged rock hidden beneath the snow. The fabric of her wool trousers tore, and warm blood spilled down her shin, a stark contrast to the freezing environment. Seraphina hit the ground, her hands plunging into the icy powder. For a fraction of a second, the overwhelming urge to just lie down and sleep washed over her. The snow felt so soft. The cold was beginning to feel less like a bite and more like a heavy weighted blanket. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the winter claim her, leaving Kaelin and Victoria to their stolen throne. But as the icy numbness began to paralyze her limbs, a sudden, radical shift in temperature flared at the very center of her being. The freezing chill creeping up her back was met by an unexpected, radiating heat blossoming deep within her pelvis. It felt like a small, burning ember had been placed directly against her frigid skin from the inside out, sending a rush of warm, oxygen-rich blood surging back into her freezing extremities. The sudden flush of heat was dizzying, breaking the hypnotic spell of the blizzard. It wasn't the mate bond. That golden thread remained dead and frozen in her chest. This was something else, a faint, rhythmic fluttering deep within her lower abdomen, a spark of pure, unadulterated warmth that aggressively pushed back the encroaching frost, demanding life. Seraphina gasped, her pale eyes snapping open. She pressed her numb, trembling hand against her stomach. The fluttering happened again, a tiny, microscopic pulse of life. It was a sensation so subtle that a human would have missed it entirely, but a wolf's heightened biology registered it with deafening clarity. She wasn't barren. The words Victoria had spoken in the study echoed in her mind, distorted by the howling wind. She is fragile. And more importantly, my king, she is barren. A lie, a massive, catastrophic lie. Seraphina's breath hitched, a puff of white steam escaping her cracked lips. She was pregnant. She was carrying Kaelan Drake's child, the true heir to the Valdris throne. The child Victoria had convinced the Alpha King did not and could not exist. A fierce, terrifying wave of primal maternal instinct exploded within Seraphina's chest. The urge to lie down and die vanished, replaced by a violent, burning need to survive. The quiet, dignified resignation that had carried her out of the fortress morphed into a lethal, protective fury. Her inner wolf, which had been curled into a ball of frost, suddenly unfurled with a silent, ferocious snarl, wrapping its spiritual presence around the tiny ember in her womb. She would not let Kaelan have this child. She would not let Victoria's toxic hands anywhere near her baby. This child would not be raised in a court of vipers and clouded judgments. This child belonged to her, and she would tear the world apart before she let anyone take it. Mine, Seraphina whispered to the howling wind, her voice raspy and broken, but laced with a sudden, absolute authority. She forced herself up from the snow. The pain in her bleeding knee was ignored. The numbness in her fingers was irrelevant. She adjusted her heavy traveling cloak, pulling the fabric tighter around her abdomen, shielding that tiny spark of warmth from the freezing world. She looked up at the towering, jagged peaks of the northern borderlands. The journey ahead was brutal. It would require every ounce of her willpower, every hidden reserve of her ancient bloodline. Seraphina was no longer just a rejected mate, walking into the void to die. She was a mother protecting a king's hidden heir. She tightened the leather strap of her bag over her shoulder, the freezing wind whipping her silver-white hair wildly around her face. With her jaw locked in determination, and the phantom heat of her unborn child fueling her frozen limbs, she took her first deliberate step into the steep incline of the frozen pass. The blizzard screamed against her, throwing walls of blinding white snow in her path, but she simply bowed her head and pushed forward. Alpha Garrick Thorne and the Ashenir Pack territory awaited her on the other side of this frozen hell. She would survive the treacherous crossing. She would build a sanctuary in the ice, far from the rot of the Valdris court. And one day, when her son was strong enough, the Alpha King would look upon the very child he had traded away, and he would finally understand the catastrophic cost of his blindness. 5 years had buried the past under mountains of unbreakable ice. The jagged peaks of the northern borderlands had tested her, starved her, and nearly frozen the blood in her veins, but they had not broken her. Seraphina had survived the crossing. She had traded the stifling, perfumed corridors of the Valdris fortress for the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Northern Territory's outermost sanctuary. Here the wind did not whisper, it roared. It tore at the heavy wooden shutters of the small clinic, seeking any crack to drive its freezing fingers through. Every morning began the same way. Before the sun even crested the jagged horizon, Seraphina would trudge through waist-deep snow to chip away at the frozen river with an iron pick. The sensory friction of the ice against her skin was a daily, violent awakening. Her knuckles, permanently bruised and raw from the blistering cold, would often bleed into the frost. She welcomed the pain. It was sharp, immediate, and undeniably real. A stark contrast to the hollow ache she had carried out of the Southern Empire. Sometimes, when the biting wind stung her eyes, unwanted memories would attempt to thaw in the corners of her mind. She would remember the massive stone hearths of the Valdris winter fortress, the suffocating heat of the royal nesting rooms lined with heavy furs, and the phantom sensation of a golden gaze resting heavily upon her. But she would immediately crush those memories beneath the weight of her survival. The warmth of Valdris was a lie. The bitter cold of Ashenir was honest. The air inside the healing cabin was thick with the sharp, medicinal tang of dried yarrow, crushed wintermint, and the earthy bitternesses of white willow bark. She stood over a scarred wooden table, rhythmically grinding a stone pestle into a heavy mortar. Her silver-white hair, once pinned into the elaborate heavy crowns of a queen, was now braided simply down her back, tied with a strip of rough leather. Her hands, which had once worn the king's heavy signet, were now stained with the green sap of healing herbs and calloused from years of relentless labor. The physical toll of grinding the rigid, dry roots sent spikes of dull pain shooting up her forearms as she pressed her weight into the stone, ignoring the tremor in her bruised muscles, crushing the dried leaves into a fine, pungent powder. This was her new empire, a quiet, anonymous existence where she was known only as the rogue healer's assistant. Healer Nora moved efficiently on the other side of the cramped room, sorting bandages made from boiled linen. The older woman was a fixture in the Ashenir territory, a pragmatist with iron-grey hair and eyes that saw far more than she ever spoke. Nora had found Seraphina half dead in the snowdrifts 5 years ago. The older woman had asked no questions about the missing pack scent, the expensive weave of her torn cloak, or the terrifying, protective fury that radiated from the pregnant stranger. Nora had simply offered her a bowl of hot broth, a cot near the fire, and a place to hide. A sudden, sharp whimper broke the rhythmic scraping of the pestle. Seraphina froze. The sound did not come from the howling wind outside. It came from the small, curtained alcove at the back of the clinic. She dropped the stone pestle. It hit the wooden table with a dull thud. In a heartbeat, she crossed the room, her maternal instincts flaring with an intensity that completely eclipsed her calm facade. She swept the heavy wool curtain aside. Luca was thrashing on the small cot, her son. The secret that had kept her moving through the blizzard when her body had begged to die. He was 5 years old, but his body was currently warring against a biological force that belonged to a much older, much more dangerous lineage. The air inside the tiny alcove was suffocatingly hot. It felt as though a furnace had been ignited directly beneath the floorboards. Seraphina dropped to her knees beside the bed, her breath catching in her throat. The child's skin was flushed a deep, terrifying crimson. Sweat plastered his dark, unruly curls to his forehead. He was panting, his small chest heaving, as if he were trying to draw oxygen from a burning room. It was not an ordinary winter fever. Seraphina pressed her cool, calloused palm against Luca's forehead and immediately pulled it back with a sharp hiss. His skin was practically radiating actual, physical heat, burning like a living coal. "Nora," Seraphina rasped, her voice tight with a suppressed, rising panic. "Bring the snow melt now." The older healer was already moving, carrying a wooden basin filled with freezing water and chunks of raw ice. Nora set it down beside the cot, her weathered face drawing into a deep frown as she felt the ambient heat rolling off the 5-year-old. Ordinary werewolf pups ran warmer than humans, but this was entirely different. This was a primal aggressive fever. It was the transition fever of a royal bloodline. Seraphina plunged a linen cloth into the freezing water, wringing it out until her knuckles turned white. She folded the freezing fabric and pressed it gently against Luca's burning neck, right over his racing pulse. The water actually hissed, turning into a faint wisp of steam against his skin. The boy let out a low, guttural growl that sounded entirely too deep, entirely too feral for a child. "His core temperature is climbing too fast," Nora murmured, keeping her voice carefully neutral, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her alarm. This isn't a simple winter chill, Sarah. I've delivered and treated pups in this territory for 40 years. I have never felt a heat like this. It feels like fire magic. Serafina didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was constricted with a terrifying, suffocating truth. She knew exactly what this heat was. She recognized the faint, crackling scent of ozone and sharp pine that was beginning to bleed through the boy's sweat. It was the genetic echo of the Alpha King, the raw, unfiltered dominance of the Valdris throne fighting to establish itself within a body that was still too small to contain it. Luca's small hands were clenched into tight, trembling fists. In his right hand he held a wooden-carved wolf toy. Serafina had whittled it for him from a block of ironwood to keep his hands busy during the long winter nights. Ironwood was incredibly dense, nearly impossible to break without a heavy axe. A sharp cracking sound echoed in the quiet alcove. Serafina watched in muted horror as the thick wooden toy suddenly splintered into jagged pieces right inside her son's tiny grip. The sheer, unnatural physical strength required to crush ironwood was impossible for a child. Blood welled up where a splinter bit into his palm, but Luca didn't cry. The pain seemed to trigger something much deeper. His small back arched off the mattress. A violent shudder ripped through his frame. "Luca, look at me," Serafina commanded, her voice dropping into a low, resonant frequency that vibrated with the suppressed authority of her own ancient bloodline. She pressed both of her hands flat against his burning chest, projecting a wave of icy, calming energy from her core, trying to desperately counter the explosive heat of his father's genetics. "Open your eyes, my sweet boy. Look at Mama." The child gasped, his chest deflating as he fought through the biological storm. Gradually, his heavy eyelids fluttered open. Nora took a sharp, sudden step backward, knocking the wooden basin with her boot. Water sloshed onto the floor. Serafina stopped breathing. Luca's eyes were no longer the soft, muddy brown of a typical toddler. The irises had been completely swallowed by a blinding, luminescent amber. They glowed in the dim light of the alcove like twin suns. It was the exact, unmistakable molten gold of Kaelan Drake, the legendary, terrifying gaze of the sovereign who had traded her away for a political alliance. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, hot breathing of the child. To look into those eyes was to look directly at the ghost of Valdris. The absolute proof of the king's lineage was currently illuminating the shadows of a rogue's clinic in rival territory. If anyone from the Ashenir court saw those eyes, they would know instantly. The child was not just a rogue's bastard. He was the hidden heir of their greatest enemy. "By the goddess," Nora breathed, her voice a fragile, terrified whisper. She looked from the glowing eyes of the boy to the pale, stricken face of her assistant. The older woman finally understood the magnitude of the secret she had been harboring. "Sarah, who is his father?" "No one," Serafina replied instantly. Her voice was no longer the soft tone of a mother. It was a sheet of pure, unyielding ice. She grabbed the freezing cloth and pressed it gently over Luca's eyes, shielding the golden glow from the room. "His father is dead." She refused to let the panic consume her. She pushed the memories of the Valdris throne room away, burying the image of the man who had dismissed her as a barren placeholder. She focused entirely on the physical reality of the child in front of her. She reached for the bowl of crushed white willow bark and mixed it rapidly with a few drops of potent, numbing snow poppy extract. "Hold his head up," she instructed the older healer, entirely taking command of the room. Nora obeyed without question, her hands trembling slightly as she supported the burning weight of the boy's neck. Serafina carefully tipped the herbal mixture past Luca's cracked lips, massaging his throat to force the swallowing reflex. The herbs were designed to violently depress the nervous system, forcing the body into a deep artificial hibernation. It was a dangerous dosage for a child, but the alternative was letting the alpha fire consume him from the inside out. For 5 agonizing minutes, they waited. Serafina kept her hands pressed firmly against his chest, refusing to break physical contact, silently pouring every ounce of her own dormant strength into his small frame. Inch by inch, the terrifying heat began to recede, The crackling scent of ozone faded, replaced once again by the smell of damp wool and herbal poultices. Luca's tense muscles finally went completely slack. His breathing deepened, shifting from rapid, shallow pants into the steady, rhythmic cadence of deep sleep. When Serafina cautiously lifted the wet cloth from his face, his eyes were closed. The golden glow had retreated beneath his eyelids, hidden once more. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the mattress. Her entire body was shaking, a delayed reaction to the massive spike of adrenaline. The air in the alcove felt incredibly cold now that the boy's unnatural heat had dissipated. Nora placed a heavy, comforting hand on her shoulder. The older woman didn't ask any more questions. The unspoken rule of the Borderlands was simple. You do not dig into a rogue's past unless you are prepared to fight the demons that chase them. The fever has broken, Nora said quietly. He will sleep through the night. You should rest, Sarah. You look like a ghost. Before Serafina could nod, a massive, violent crash echoed from the front of the clinic. The heavy wooden doors were kicked open with such force that one of the iron hinges snapped. The wind from the blizzard instantly roared into the room, extinguishing the oil lamps and sending a flurry of snow swirling across the floorboards. Serafina shot to her feet, her hand instantly dropping to the bone-handled hunting knife strapped to her thigh. Her maternal terror morphed seamlessly into a cold, lethal readiness. She stepped in front of the alcove curtain, shielding her sleeping son from whatever had just breached their sanctuary. The clinic filled with the overwhelming metallic stench of fresh blood, scorched flesh, and the dark, bitter tang of poisoned silver. 4 massive warriors filed into the room. They were clad in heavy black leather armor, their shoulders dusted with snow. They were Ashenir elite guards, their faces grim and their eyes glowing with the chaotic, unsettled energy of a pack in distress. Between them, supporting his massive weight, was a man who seemed to swallow all the light in the room. Alpha Garrick Thorn, the ruler of the Northern Wastes. He was a mountain of a man, built with the rugged, brutal architecture of a warlord who had spent his entire life defending a hostile border. His dark shoulder-length hair was matted with sweat and melting snow. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched beneath his scarred skin. But it was the right side of his torso that drew all the oxygen from the room. His heavy armor had been ripped open, exposing a massive, jagged laceration that tore diagonally across his ribs. The wound was not healing. Typical werewolf biology would have already knit the flesh back together. But this cut was bubbling with a sickly, black foam. The unmistakable scent of liquid silver and nightshade poison radiated from the injury. It was a lethal combination designed specifically to rot an alpha's healing factor from the inside out. "Clear the table," one of the guards snarled, his voice a frantic bark that rattled the glass vials on the shelves. "The alpha has been poisoned. Move!" Nora rushed forward, her face draining of color as she saw the extent of the damage. "Put him down gently. Goddess above, that is a silver-laced blade wound. Strip the armor off him." The warriors hauled their leader onto the central wooden table. Garrick did not scream, though a low, rumbling growl vibrated deep within his chest, a sound born of pure physical agony. The wooden table creaked ominously under his immense weight. Nora's hands shook as she reached for her surgical tools. She was a skilled midwife and an expert in local ailments, but treating a poisoned alpha of this magnitude was beyond the scope of a village clinic. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of Garrick's aura in pain was making the air in the room unbreathable. The frantic pheromones of his elite guard were only amplifying the chaos, turning the small cabin into a powder keg of predatory anxiety. Serafina stood perfectly still by the alcove. Her piercing gaze analyzed the situation with clinical detachment. The wound was fatal if the silver wasn't neutralized immediately. The nightshade was already working its way into his bloodstream, evident by the dark, crawling veins branching out from the laceration. Nora was panicking. The guards were pacing like caged wolves, their claws fully extended, ready to tear apart anyone who failed their king. Serafina let go of her hunting knife. She stepped away from the curtain. She walked into the center of the chaotic room. Her movements were entirely devoid of fear. She did not cower beneath the oppressive weight of the Alpha's aura. She did not lower her eyes in submission. She moved with the silent, absolute grace of a woman who had once commanded a fortress twice this size. "Step back," Seraphina said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the frantic barking of the guards like a blade through silk. The largest warrior, a brute with a scarred eye, turned and bared his teeth at her. "Know your place, rogue. Fetch the main healer to mend him, or I'll mount your head on a spike." Seraphina did not flinch. She stepped directly into the guard's personal space, tilting her head slightly, her eyes locked onto his with a chilling, dead calm intensity. "Your Alpha's blood is currently boiling with silver nitrate. In exactly 4 minutes, it will reach his heart, and he will die on this table while you stand here shouting. Now move out of my light, or I will let him rot." The guard blinked, stunned by the sheer unyielding authority radiating from the small, silver-haired woman. Before he could argue, a massive, blood-stained hand reached out and gripped the guard's forearm. "Do as she says." The voice was a deep, gravelly rasp. It commanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. Alpha Garrick Thorne turned his head on the wooden table, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto Seraphina. His chest he heaved as he fought the poison, but his gaze was terrifyingly sharp. He studied her face, taking in the cheap wool of her dress, the herbal stains on her hands, and the absolute lack of submission in her posture. The guards instantly backed away, forming a tight, anxious perimeter near the broken door. Seraphina moved to the table. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for permission. She pressed her hands firmly against the skin on either side of the massive, bubbling wound. Garrick's skin was burning with the same intense fever she had just treated in her son, though his was fueled by trauma, not transition. "Nora," Seraphina ordered, her voice slipping into a steady, surgical rhythm. "I need the charcoal poultice, the highest concentration of wolfsbane antidote we have, and the iron tongs, not the silver ones, iron." Nora scrambled to fetch the items, grateful for the sudden direction. Seraphina leaned over the Alpha. The stench of the poisoned blood was nauseating, but she didn't blink. She grabbed a clean linen cloth and wiped away the worst of the black foam, exposing the raw, ruined muscle beneath. The blade had bitten deep, scraping against his ribs. Small, jagged shards of silver shrapnel had been left behind in the tissue, acting as continuous burning anchors of poison. "This will be unpleasant," she murmured, her tone completely objective. Garrick gritted his teeth, his massive jaw locking into place. "Do it!" She took the iron tongs from Nora. With agonizing precision, she plunged the cold metal directly into the open wound. The moment the iron clamped onto the first shard of silver, Garrick's entire body went rigid. A deafening, feral snarl ripped from his throat, shaking the dust from the rafters. The guards at the door surged forward instinctively. "Stay exactly where you are!" Seraphina snapped without looking up, pulling the first bloody piece of silver free and dropping it into a metal basin with a sharp clink. She went back in for the second, then the third. Her hands were perfectly steady. She did not apologize for the pain. She did not offer sweet, useless words of comfort. She worked with a ruthless, singular focus, mapping the internal damage of his chest like a territory she was determined to conquer. As she worked, something strange began to happen in the cramped, blood-soaked room. Garrick's dark eyes remained fixed entirely on her face. The agonizing pain of the surgery was pushing him to the absolute brink of his feral instincts. His inner beast was clawing at the surface, desperate to shift, to lash out at the source of the pain. It was a biological response he had spent decades learning to control, but the poison was shredding his mental barriers. But as Seraphina leaned closer, her silver hair brushing against his collarbone, the Alpha's feral panic suddenly slammed into an invisible wall. It was her aura. Seraphina had severed her connection to the Valdris pack. She had buried her scent under layers of bitter herbs and isolation. To the guards by the door, she smelled like nothing more than crushed leaves and old snow, but Garrick was an Alpha, a true ancient sovereign of the North. At this proximity, with his senses stripped bare by the poison, he didn't just smell her. He felt her, Beneath the scent of the mint and the blood, there was a quiet, suffocating gravity. It was a sensation of absolute, unshakable stability, a cold, pristine lake in the middle of a burning forest. The frantic, chaotic energy of his poisoned inner wolf slammed into her spiritual presence and was immediately, forcibly grounded. It was a physiological response he had never experienced. His beast did not want to attack her. It wanted to bow its head. The realization hit Garrick harder than the silver shrapnel. The woman holding the iron tongs inside his chest was not a simple rogue healer. She was a sovereign. She carried the heavy, dormant weight of a true Luna, the kind of ancient, stabilizing presence that entire empires went to war over. Seraphina pulled the final, largest piece of silver from the wound. She dropped it into the basin. She immediately grabbed a handful of the black charcoal and wolfsbane poultice, packing it forcefully into the laceration to neutralize the remaining poison in the tissue. Garrick let out a long, shuddering breath as the burning sensation was finally extinguished by the cold, drawing mud. The black veins branching across his ribs immediately stopped their progression, receding smoothly beneath the skin. "The silver is out," Seraphina said, stepping back from the table. She wiped her bloody hands on a clean towel, her breathing even. "Your healing factor will handle the rest. Keep the poultice on for 2 days. Drink willow bark tea for the fever." Garrick carefully pushed himself up onto his elbows. His chest was wrapped in pain, but the lethal threat was gone. He looked at the bloody basin, then back up at the small woman standing perfectly still in the center of the room. He noticed the way she positioned herself, subtly keeping her body between the heavy wooden table and a curtained alcove in the back of the room. A protective stance. The stance of a mother guarding a nest. The guards rushed forward to assist him, but Garrick raised a hand, stopping them in their tracks. He swung his heavy boots over the edge of the table, sitting up fully. The sheer size of him dwarfed the furniture in the room. He towered over Seraphina, the dangerous, predatory energy of the Northern King radiating from every muscle. He didn't speak immediately. He analyzed her. The cold, defiant pride in her grey eyes, the lack of submission, the absolute competence of her hands. "What is your name?" Garrick finally asked. The gravel in his voice had smoothed into a low, resonant rumble of intense curiosity. "Sarah," she replied, offering only the half-truth. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her spine straight. Garrick tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. He could feel the lie of omission, but he did not press it. He respected the silence of a survivor. He reached up and touched the thick bandage packed with dark mud. He had fought in hundreds of battles. He had been treated by the finest royal physicians in the Northern Hemisphere. None of them possessed the terrifying calm of the woman standing before him. "You saved my life, Sarah," the Alpha said, his tone shifting into something solemn and deeply respectful. "The Ashenir Pack owes you a blood debt. If you ever require sanctuary, or protection from whatever ghosts you are hiding from in this frozen wasteland, you only have to ask." Seraphina looked at the massive, scarred warlord. She knew exactly who he was. She knew that accepting a favor from Cailan Drake's greatest rival was a dangerous game of political treason. But as she heard the faint, even breathing of her son coming from the alcove, she also knew that the time for hiding in the shadows was rapidly coming to an end. A boy with molten gold eyes could not remain a secret forever. "I will remember that, Alpha," Seraphina said softly, her voice cool and devoid of any gratitude. Garrick Thorne held her gaze for a long, heavy second. He saw the ice in her eyes. He felt the terrifying, dormant power of the crown she had abandoned. Without another word, the Alpha King of the North deliberately bowed his head to the rogue healer. It was a small gesture, a fractional lowering of the chin. But in the hierarchical world of wolves, an alpha bowing to an unranked female was a seismic event. The guards stared in absolute stunned silence. Then Garrick turned and walked out into the howling blizzard, leaving Seraphina standing in the bloody aftermath, entirely aware that the quiet peace of her exile had just been permanently shattered. The doors closed behind Alpha Garrick with a sound like the end of the world, and only then, in the empty corridor of the small healing clinic where no one could see, did Serafina's hands begin to shake. She kept her spine straight. She didn't collapse against the rough-hewn wooden walls. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome 5 years ago, and crumbling now would not protect the fragile, quiet life she had built. The absolute peace of her exile was over. Alpha Garrick had recognized the ancient bloodline humming beneath her skin, the dormant power she had suppressed since the night she walked away from the winter fortress of Valdris. He had bowed to it. She turned and walked into the back room of the cottage. The air here was heavy and warm, saturated with the scent of dried sage, crushed pine needles, and the faint, coppery tang of the blood she had just cleaned. Healer Nora stood by the stone hearth, her practical hands wringing a damp cloth over a wooden basin. Nora looked up, her expression a chaotic mix of awe and lingering terror from the Alpha's stunning display of submission. "He bowed to you, Sarah," Nora whispered, the words trembling as they left her lips. "The Alpha King of the North bowed to an unranked rogue. He bowed to a ghost, Nora," Serafina corrected, her voice smooth and devoid of the violent storm raging in her own chest. "And ghosts are only dangerous if they are remembered." She stepped past the older woman, her gaze locking instantly onto the small cot nestled in the warmest corner of the room. Luca was sleeping, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. The fever that had gripped him for 3 days had finally broken, thanks to the dangerous ancient healing magic Serafina had pulled directly from her own veins. Healing was not native to the Stormglass lineage of her ancestors, but desperation had forced the magic in her blood to mutate. Every time she pulled the sickness from her son's small body, she felt a corresponding chill settle deep into her own lungs. It was a painful, exhausting exchange, but she welcomed it. She would drain her own life force, drop by drop, if it meant keeping him safe. She knelt beside the bed, her fingers gently brushing a lock of dark hair from his damp forehead. Then his eyelids fluttered. He looked at her. The breath stalled in Serafina's throat, exactly as it did every single time her son opened his eyes. They were not the storm-glass grey of her own lineage. They were molten gold, amber fire trapped in ice. They were the exact, undeniable, terrifying replica of the Alpha King who had discarded her. Luca was highly perceptive, carrying a quiet resilience that mirrored her own, but he carried his father's rare genetic markers like a brilliant, dangerous beacon. A beacon she had kept hidden in the furthest reaches of the northern mountains, nestled deep within the unforgiving snowdrifts. "Mama," the 5-year-old murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "It's cold." "I know, my sweet wolf," she whispered, pulling the heavy fur blanket up to his chin. She leaned down, pressing her lips to his fever-damp forehead. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone." Serafina didn't know the Alpha King's kingdom was currently collapsing. She didn't know that the very air in Valdris was turning to ash, and she definitely didn't know that the man who had promised another woman the throne was slowly suffocating under the weight of a curse he couldn't even name. All she knew was the steady warmth of her son's skin against hers, and the absolute certainty that she would slaughter anyone who tried to take him from her. Hundreds of miles south, the winter fortress of Valdris was dying. The decay was not an abstract concept. It was a physical, measurable rotting of the land and the pack. The ancient wards that protected the castle boundaries were crumbling, shedding sparks of dead magic into the thin, ozone-tinged air. The crops had withered beneath an unseasonal, unending frost. The rivers, once rushing arteries of life, were frozen solid, their surfaces jagged and hostile. The pack was starving, not just for food, but for the spiritual anchor that only a true Luna could provide. The absence of her spiritual presence was destabilizing the entire hierarchy. Wolves grew aggressive, lethargic, snapping at shadows and pacing endlessly in their minds, mourning a bond they had never been allowed to form. And at the center of the rot sat King Kaelan. The throne room was carved from winter itself. Black stone pillars arched high into the oppressive darkness of the ceiling. The banners of the royal house hung limp, their vibrant crimson faded to a sickly rust. Kaelan sat motionless on the obsidian throne, the cold seeping through his thick leather armor, settling deep into his bones. He had stopped lighting the main hearths 3 years ago. If his soul was destined to freeze in the dark, he saw no reason for his body to be warm. He was a miserable shell of the terrifying warlord he had once been. His broad shoulders were slumped, his devastatingly handsome face gaunt, his strong jaw covered in rough, untended stubble. His eyes, once a blazing, terrifying gold, were dull, clouded by a perpetual toxic fog. His chest was a hollow cavity. Every breath he took felt like inhaling crushed glass. The fated mate bond, a sacred covenant meant to be a river of liquid silver connecting two souls, was a jagged, open wound that bled phantom pain into his marrow every second of every day. He raised his right hand. His scarred fingers trembled slightly. Pinched between his thumb and forefinger was the legendary golden relic, the ancestral royal band. It was a heavy, ancient ring forged of white gold, inset with a raw amber core. Legend dictated that the core would glow with the heat of 1,000 suns when in contact with the true Luna. Now, the amber was dead. It was grey, opaque, and cold to the touch, a mocking reminder of the night he had shattered his own destiny. Cailan stared at it, his thumb tracing the smooth, lifeless stone. The memory of the solstice ceremony played in his mind on an endless, agonizing loop. The grand royal banquet, the expectation. He remembered standing before the pack, his mouth moving, hearing his own voice promise the Luna's throne to Lady Victoria. He remembered the absolute silence that had followed. He remembered the feeling of a blade sliding cleanly through his soul, severing something vital. But most of all, he remembered waking up the next morning to discover the castle utterly silent. He remembered bursting into Seraphina's chambers, his chest heaving, only to see the simple, unadorned silver pack token she had worn sitting dead center on her vanity. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown a tantrum. She hadn't begged. She had simply accepted his public rejection, in absolute, dignified silence, erased her scent, and disappeared into the howling blizzard without a single word. He watched her leave in his nightmares, over and over. Like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest, he had given Victoria the title. He had given her the Luna crown. He had even given her a heavily jeweled wedding band. But when Victoria had reached for the royal ring of his ancestors, Cailan's primal wolf had violently seized control, snapping its jaws so fiercely that the entire council had stepped back in terror. He had refused to hand it to her. His wolf would not allow it, because deep down, beneath the suffocating fog in his mind, his beast knew the truth. The heavy oak doors of the throne room creaked open, breaking the deathly silence. King Cailan. Cailan didn't look up. The scent of moonshade petals drifted into the room, sickly sweet and cloying. It wrapped around his senses, dulling the sharp edges of his pain, but it also made him violently nauseous. It was a fake, manufactured scent designed to mask reality. Lady Victoria stepped into the dim light. She was dressed in opulent crimson velvet, the heavy Luna crown resting perfectly on her meticulously coiffed hair. She was stunning. She was manipulative. She was everything the high nobility demanded, and Cailan felt absolutely nothing for her. "The council is asking for an audience," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She walked closer, her heels clicking sharply against the frozen stone floor. "The eastern borders have reported another breach. We need you to speak to them, Cailan." "Let them wait," Cailan rasped. His voice was raw, a low, guttural growl that belonged more to a wounded beast than a man. Victoria's smile faltered, her jaw tightening. She stopped a full 10 feet away from the throne. She never got too close anymore. Not after the last time she had tried to touch him, and his wolf had nearly torn her arm from its socket in a blind, protective panic for a mate that wasn't there. "You cannot keep neglecting the pack," Victoria said, a sharp edge of frustration bleeding into her tone. "They look to me for guidance, but they need their alpha's strength." Cailan slowly lifted his head, his dull golden eyes locked onto hers. "My strength left this castle 5 years ago," he said, the words heavy and completely devoid of emotion. "And you know it." Victoria flinched as if struck. Her hands balled into tight fists at her sides, her manicured nails digging deep into her palms. She hated the ghost of Seraphina. She hated the quiet, unassuming female who had managed to hold the Alpha King's soul captive even from beyond the icy borders of the known world. "She is dead, Kaelin," Victoria stated, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "No one could survive the winter blizzards alone without a pack. It has been 5 years. You must let her go." A low, vibrating snarl echoed in Kaelin's chest. The sound was purely instinctual, a violent rejection of the lie. His wolf clawed at the insides of his ribs, screaming a single unbroken truth into the void. "Not dead, my mate. Hidden, my true mate. Leave," Kaelin commanded. Single word. A death sentence, if disobeyed. Victoria's face flushed with indignation, but she knew better than to push him. When his eyes flickered to that dangerous, primal shade, she bowed stiffly, turning on her heel and marching out of the throne room. As soon as the doors slammed shut, Victoria's composure shattered. She hurried down the dark, winding corridors of the fortress, bypassing her own lavish chambers and descending into the bowels of the castle. The air grew damp, smelling of mildew and stagnant water. The shadows clung to her velvet dress like grasping fingers. She hated the catacombs, but it was the only place the Alpha King's enhanced hearing could not reach. She reached the lowest level, pushing open a rusted iron grate. Inside a small, windowless cell stood a man wrapped in dark leather, a network of brutal scars mapping his face. He was a mercenary tracker, completely unassociated with the Valdris pack. "Did you discover the source of the rumors?" Victoria demanded, her voice a sharp hiss in the darkness. The tracker bowed his head. "I traveled to the Ashenir territory, my lady. Their pack is incredibly protective of its borders. Alpha Garrick has fortified the region." "I don't care about Garrick," Victoria snapped, stepping closer, her eyes flashing with desperate malice. "I asked about the healer, the white wolf they keep whispering about." The tracker hesitated, shifting his weight. "The rumors are true. There is an unranked female living in a cottage on the edge of the Ashenir lands. She possesses ancient healing magic. The locals revere her. They say Alpha Garrick himself bows to her." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. A cold, suffocating dread wrapped around her throat. It couldn't be. Seraphina was weak. She was broken. She was supposed to have frozen to death in the snow. "And the child?" Victoria asked, the words barely a whisper. "A boy, 5 years old," the tracker replied. "He stays hidden most of the time, but my scouts managed to catch a glimpse of him through the window. He has golden eyes, my lady, molten gold, the lunar elixir, the clear, odorless potion brewed from moonshade petals she had been secretly dosing the king with for 5 years, felt suddenly, terrifyingly useless. It was designed to cloud Kaelin's rational mind, to suppress his instincts and mask the true fated scent. It had allowed her to manipulate her way onto the throne. It had allowed her to steal a life that wasn't hers, but a child, a secret royal heir with the unmistakable genetic mark of the Alpha King. That was concrete, physical proof that could shatter her entire fragile empire in an instant. No amount of elixir could erase a bloodline. Victoria pulled a heavy pouch of gold coins from her cloak and tossed it at the tracker's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "Take a squad of your best men," Victoria ordered, her voice completely devoid of humanity. "Travel back to the northern borders. Wait until Alpha Garrick is occupied. Burn the cottage to the ground. Hunt down the woman, locate the child, and leave no trace." The tracker scooped up the gold, a grim smile twisting his scarred lips. "As you command, Luna." Victoria didn't correct him, but the title tasted like ash on her tongue. She turned and fled the catacombs, a desperate woman clinging to a stolen crown, terrified of the true queen's return. Spring bled into summer, and summer faded into the crisp, bitter chill of autumn. The autumn equinox of the 6th year approached with a heavy, ominous stillness in the air. In the Ashenir pack, Seraphina's life had settled back into a delicate, fragile rhythm. Alpha Garrick had kept his distance since the day in the clinic, honoring her silent plea for privacy, but his protection was an invisible, ironclad shield around her small cottage. The respect from the pack members had deepened into a quiet, almost religious reverence, but Seraphina knew the peace was temporary. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, and the truth of Luca's bloodline was becoming impossible to hide. Luca was growing taller, his features sharpening, mirroring the devastatingly handsome Alpha King more with each passing day. He was fiercely protective of his mother, possessing an intelligence and a silent gravity that belonged in a throne room, not a humble wooden cabin. He asked about his father again today, Healer Nora said softly, arranging dried lavender bundles on the rustic wooden table. Serafina paused, her hands hovering over a mortar and pestle. The scent of crushed pine filled the warm room. She stood perfectly still, looking out the frost-covered window, her silver-flecked irises reflecting the bleak, snowy landscape. "And what did you tell him?" Serafina asked, her voice steady. "I told him that some wounds can only be healed with love, and that his mother is the bravest woman I have ever known," Nora replied. She walked over, placing a gentle hand on Serafina's shoulder. "Sera, you cannot keep him in the shadows forever. He is a king's son." "He is my son," Serafina corrected sharply, a protective fury flaring in her chest. "He is safe here, not used, not owned, chosen." She refused to let Luca become a pawn in Valdris's political games. She refused to let him be subjected to the same humiliation she had endured on that grand, wretched solstice night. She had stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She would never step aside again. She would burn the entire kingdom to the ground before she allowed anyone to threaten her child. But fate, it seemed, was tired of waiting. The starvation and decay of Valdris had reached a critical, irreversible tipping point. King Cailan had no choice. His pride had long since been ground into dust by the relentless agony of his broken mate bond. To save his dying people, he was forced to travel to the Northern Territories to renegotiate trade treaties and beg for resources from his greatest rival, Alpha Garrick. The journey to the Ashenir border took 3 grueling days. For 3 nights, Cailan slept in a freezing military tent pitched in the snow. For 3 nights, the nightmares came with relentless cruelty. He dreamed of Serafina's striking grey eyes, looking at him not with anger, but with a profound, quiet pity that destroyed him faster than any blade. He would wake up gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs, his massive hands grasping at the empty, freezing air beside him. He would hold the blazing royal signet to his chest and wait for dawn, a king ruling over nothing but his own colossal regrets. The border market was a sprawling, chaotic hub of activity, built into a natural valley between the 2 territories. Tents of dyed canvas flapped in the wind. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, wood smoke, and wet pine. Cailan dismounted his massive black warhorse. The snow crunched heavily beneath his boots. His guards immediately fanned out, their hands resting cautiously on the hilts of their swords. The tension was palpable. Valdris and Ashenir were not allies. Cailan walked through the crowded market, his golden eyes scanning the throngs of people with dull indifference. He kept his head bowed slightly, the weight of his failing kingdom pressing down on his spine. He needed to find Garrick's pavilion. He needed to sign the treaty, secure the grain, and return to his freezing tomb. He stepped past a merchant selling woven blankets, and then he stopped. It happened in a fraction of a second. A sudden, violent tug snapped against his sternum, so forceful it nearly brought the massive Alpha King to his knees. The hollow cavity in his chest exploded with a sudden, blinding rush of heat. The suffocating fog of the lunar elixir that had clouded his mind for 5 years cracked. It splintered like a sheet of ice struck by a warhammer. Cailan gasped, his hand flying to his chest. His heart, which had beaten in a slow, agonizing rhythm for 5 years, suddenly hammered against his ribs like a war drum. The air shifted. The overwhelming smells of the market, the smoke, the sweat, the spices vanished. They were replaced by a single, impossible scent: fresh rain, cedar wood, and a deep, profound winter chill. Serafina. Keelan's head snapped up, his eyes, suddenly blazing with the terrifying molten gold fire of a fully awakened alpha, scanned the crowd with frantic primal desperation. His wolf was clawing at the inside of his skin, howling in a chaotic mix of fury, absolute relief, and frantic need. He pushed past his guards, ignoring their startled shouts. He shoved through a group of traveling merchants, his massive frame clearing a path through sheer, terrifying force. "King Cailan!" a guard yelled. Cailan didn't hear him. He was operating on pure, biological instinct. The golden thread of the mate bond, dormant and bleeding for half a decade, was suddenly singing, pulling him forward with undeniable gravity. He broke through the edge of the crowd, stumbling into a small clearing near the apothecary stalls. His breath caught in his throat. The world stopped spinning. Time froze into a single crystalline moment. Standing 20 feet away, bundled in a thick grey fur cloak, was a 5-year-old boy. The child had dark hair, wind-swept and messy, but it was his eyes that made Cailan's soul violently shatter. They were molten gold, a perfect mirror of his own. Lucius blinked. The molten gold irises, so rare, so violently familiar, locked onto the towering sovereign. Time stopped. Cailan's lungs forgot how to draw oxygen. The golden thread in his chest, dead and frozen for 5 grueling years, suddenly ignited with a white-hot, agonizing spark. The sudden surge of biological electricity was so intense it forced the massive warlord to stagger a half-step backward, his scarred hand gripping the polished steel of his chest plate. The word thundered through their bond like a war drum. Mine. It was not just a child. It was his flesh, his blood. The absolute undeniable proof of a lineage he had been convinced was impossible. His Pot's 5-year-old son, Lucius, stood quietly in the snow, wearing a thick grey fur cloak, holding a small woven basket of winter mint. The boy's expression carried a silent, heavy gravity that perfectly mirrored King Cailan's own battle-hardened demeanor. The tilt of his chin, the unwavering stare. It was a profound, world-shattering revelation that ripped the breath from Cailan's throat. His son, his heir, alive, breathing, and looking at him with eyes that held the very same fire that burned in the royal lineage of Valdris. Before King Cailan could push past the freezing paralysis of his shock, the sensory landscape of the bustling border market violently shifted. The sharp, clean scent of the northern pines and roasted meats was suddenly overpowered by a suffocating, unnatural stench. It was a sickly sweet metallic odor that made the king's upper lip curl in an involuntary snarl. The alpha's feral instincts, buried for years beneath the toxic fog of the royal court, snapped awake with lethal precision. His enhanced hearing caught the subtle, mechanical click of a heavy crossbow trigger engaging. The sound originated from the shadowed roof of a canvas awning directly above the apothecary stalls, aimed not at the king, but straight down at Lucius. King Cailan did not think. He exploded into motion. The physical force of his launch shattered the wooden floorboards beneath his heavy leather boots. He moved faster than the human eye could track, a blur of dark armor and primal fury. A heavy silver-tipped bolt tore through the freezing air, humming with lethal velocity. It never reached Lucius. King Cailan threw his massive body into the projectile's path, raising his armored forearm. The bolt slammed into the steel bracer with a deafening crack, deflecting upward and embedding itself harmlessly into a thick pine beam. A collective scream erupted from the merchants. Chaos consumed the market as civilians scrambled for cover, overturning wooden carts and baskets of winter mint in their frantic bid for survival. The sovereign did not pause to check his armor. He launched himself upward, his powerful legs propelling him onto the canvas awning in a single, gravity-defying leap. He crashed through the wooden support structures, his massive hands reaching into the shadows. His fingers closed around the thick leather collar of a fleeing mercenary. It was a scarred tracker from the Valdris catacombs. With the terrifying, guttural roar, King Cailan hurled the assassin off the roof. The man slammed into the frozen earth below, the impact breaking several ribs with a sickening crunch. King Cailan landed gracefully beside him, his boots hitting the snow without a sound. The golden fire in the king's eyes was absolute, blinding, and completely devoid of mercy. He placed his heavy boot directly over the tracker's throat, applying just enough pressure to restrict the airflow. "Who gave the order?" the Alpha rasped. His voice was a demonic, vibrating frequency that forced the surrounding guards to drop to their knees in pure biological submission. The mercenary gasped for air, his hands clawing uselessly at the king's armored leg. Blood bubbled past his lips. "Lady Victoria," he choked out, his eyes wide with primal terror. She gave the order. "Kill the boy, and Lucius, slay the true heir." The words struck King Cailan with the force of a falling mountain. Lady Victoria. The woman he had intended to seat on the winter throne beside him. The woman who had sworn loyalty to the Valdris crown. She had orchestrated the execution of his own bloodline. The sheer magnitude of her treason carved out his ribs from the inside, leaving his chest cavity hollow and flooded with a sickening, freezing dread. He had banished his mated mate into a blizzard, believing her to be a barren placeholder, and all the while, a serpent had been sleeping in his own fortress. He had been so blind, so fundamentally broken. King Cailan pressed his boot down, crushing the mercenary's collarbone and rendering him unconscious. He stepped back, his chest heaving as the cold northern air filled his lungs. He turned his head toward the spot where his son had been standing. Lucius was gone. The chaotic crowd had swallowed him completely. "Lock down the entire border," King Cailan commanded, his voice echoing across the panicked market. He drew his broadsword, the heavy steel catching the pale winter sunlight. "Do not let a single rogue cross back into Valdris. You follow me now." The elite guards of the Southern Empire immediately fell into a tight, heavily armed formation behind their king. They marched directly out of the neutral market zone, crossing the invisible boundary into the territory of the rival northern clans. The hunt became an agonizing test of endurance that stripped King Cailan down to his most primal instincts. For 2 grueling days and nights, the Alpha King scoured the frozen expanse of the jagged peaksocks. The hostile terrain of the northern borderlands fought him at every turn. Blizzards roared down from the mountain summits, burying tracks beneath feet of fresh, blinding snow. His heavy royal battle armor, designed to withstand the crushing blows of warhammers, grew agonizingly cold. The steel plates froze against the thick leather beneath, turning into a tomb of ice that leached the core heat directly from his bones. Ice crystallized on his eyelashes, his breath tearing from his lungs in ragged white clouds. Yet he did not stop to rest. He did not eat. The mysterious fog that had clouded his mind for 5 years began to tear through his biology in a violent, sickening purge. He collapsed against a frozen pine at dawn of the second day, his armored hands gripping the rough bark as he retched violently, coughing up thick, dark bile, tainted with a foul, metallic stench. He did not understand the biological source of the sickness yet, only that a toxic veil was finally breaking down, and reality was crashing back with the force of a tidal wave. He had exiled her. He had stood in the warmth of the throne room and promised her rightful place to a traitor, while his true mate, the silent, unbreakable anchor of his soul, walked into this very blizzard, alone, carrying his unborn son. A guttural sob ripped from King Cailan's throat, a sound so broken and pathetic it didn't belong to a king. The golden thread of the mate bond, now fully awake and pulsing with a frantic, desperate rhythm, pulled at his sternum with the magnetic force of a dying star. It was a physical agony, a relentless burning sensation that demanded he find her. It was the only warmth keeping him alive in the sub-zero wasteland. His inner beast thrashed frantically against his ribs, howling in sheer terror at the prospect of losing the scent forever. He tracked the faint remnants. It was buried beneath the smell of panicked sweat, trampled snow, and the biting frost, but his awakened beast zeroed in on it. He followed the unmistakable aroma of cedar wood and fresh rain. The signature scent he had convinced himself was gone forever. Every step he took through the deep snowdrifts felt like wading through liquid lead, weighed down by the sudden, crushing reality of his own colossal guilt. His mind was a tempest of regret. How had he been so profoundly blind? She is alive. The realization repeated in his mind on an endless, agonizing loop. She survived the winter I cast her into. She bore my child in the wilderness. By the afternoon of the second day, the trail finally led away from the lower valley, winding up a steep, icy incline toward a secluded wooden clinic nestled beneath the towering, jagged cliffs. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. He knew Healer Nora operated here, a practical sanctuary within Alpha Garrick's lands. King Cailan did not knock. His patience had been entirely consumed by the roaring demands of his inner beast and 2 days of sleep-deprived panic. He hit the heavy oak with his armored shoulder. The force of the impact snapped the iron hinges like dry twigs. The broken clinic door exploded inward, sending jagged splinters of wood flying across the rustic floorboards. The freezing wind howled into the warm, herb-scented room, extinguishing the oil lamps in a sudden rush of darkness. King Cailan stepped through the shattered threshold, his broadsword dripping with melted snow. He froze in utter shock, standing in the center of the room, illuminated only by the glowing embers of the stone hearth, was Seraphina. She was breathtaking. The elaborate, heavy silks of the southern court were gone, replaced by simple, practical woven wool and a leather bodice. Her silver-white hair hung in a thick braid over her shoulder. She did not look like a fragile, discarded Omega. She looked like a wild, untamed sovereign of the ice. But it was the visual tableau that made King Cailan's breath completely stall in his throat. Seraphina was not alone. She was standing in a fiercely protective stance, her body angled to shield Lucius, her sweet Luca, who was tucked securely behind her skirts. She placed a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder, and standing directly beside her, a massive broadsword already drawn and resting casually against his shoulder, was Alpha Garrick. The rival warlord's dark eyes locked onto King Cailan, radiating a territorial, lethal warning that sent a violent shockwave of pure jealousy crashing through the Valdris king's veins. The sight of his fated mate, standing protectively beside his greatest enemy, was a serrated blade, twisting deep into King Cailan's gut. The physical pain of it was staggering, a hollow ache that rivaled the cold of the blizzard outside. "Sera," King Cailan breathed. The name tore his throat raw. It was a plea, a prayer, and a confession all wrapped into 2 desperate syllables. She did not flinch. The silvery tempest of her gaze met his blazing golden stare, and they held absolutely no affection. There was no warmth. There was only the cold, dead, absolute zero of a winter blizzard. She did not run to him. She did not weep with relief. Instead, her right hand dropped smoothly to the bone-handled hunting knife strapped to her thigh. "Stay behind me, Luca," Seraphina commanded softly, her voice steady and unbroken. Then, she lifted her chin, her gaze locking onto the intruder. "Step out of my sanctuary, King Cailan. You have crossed a border that does not belong to you. He is my son." King Cailan choked out, taking a single desperate step forward, his hands trembling. "A son you cast into a blizzard," Alpha Garrick's voice rumbled, heavy with utter disgust. The northern warlord stepped squarely between the desperate king and the silver-haired mother, his massive frame shielding them both. "Because your mind was rotting from the inside out. Did you even know, King Cailan? Did you realize your precious Lady Victoria has been lacing your wine with the lunar elixir for 5 long years?" The words hit King Cailan like a physical blow. The air in his lungs vanished, a clear, odorless potion brewed from moonshade petals. Alpha Garrick continued mercilessly, his voice echoing in the small clinic, used to mask natural fated sense and cloud rational judgment. "She poisoned you to steal a throne that was never hers, and you let her." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal finally locked into place. The sickening purge in the woods, the foul metallic stench he had been coughing up, the total blindness that had led him to promise another woman the throne. Lady Victoria had orchestrated it all. She had systematically erased his bond to Seraphina using the lunar elixir. Before King Cailan could even have processed the crushing weight of that revelation, the amber-cord sovereign ring on his right hand, dead for 5 years, suddenly flared to life. The raw amber core ignited, glowing with a brilliant, blinding heat as it reacted to Seraphina's proximity. The physical proof of her divine right to the throne illuminated the darkened clinic, painting the wooden walls in hues of molten fire. It was an ancestral confirmation that no poison could ever permanently break. But before the explosive standoff could escalate into bloodshed, the deafening sound of marching boots and snarling wolves echoed from the snowy incline outside. The tense silence in the clinic shattered. Lady Victoria had arrived. Driven completely mad by the failure of her tracker at the market, and the terrifying realization that her stolen position was collapsing, the antagonist had abandoned the shadows. She had brought a massive force of rogue mercenaries, bypassing the border patrols and tracking King Kaelan's movements directly to the isolated cabin over the past 2 days. Lady Victoria stepped through the splintered doorway, flanked by heavily armed mercenaries. Her opulent crimson velvet dress was stained with snow and mud, her meticulously coiffed hair wild and unraveled. The sickening scent of concentrated moonshade flooded the small room, clashing violently against the clean aroma of cedar and pine. Lady Victoria's eyes darted frantically around the room, skipping entirely over the 2 massive alphas and locking directly onto Lucius hiding behind Seraphina's skirts. Lucius peered around his mother's leg, his molten gold eyes shining in the dim light. The sound of pure, unhinged desperation ripped from Lady Victoria's throat. Her elaborate political schemes, her 5 years of secret poisonings using the lunar elixir, her stolen crown, all of it meant absolutely nothing as long as that boy drew breath. "Destroy them," Lady Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical malice. "Burn the clinic. If the boy dies, the Valdris throne remains mine." The rogue mercenaries surged forward, their silver-laced blades drawn. Lady Victoria herself moved with a sudden venomous speed. She pulled a cluster of heavy glass vials from her cloak. They were filled with highly concentrated poison, mixed with fine, powdered silver shrapnel, a lethal, volatile compound designed to completely destroy a werewolf's respiratory system upon impact. With a scream of pure hatred, she hurled the poisoned weapons directly at Lucius. King Kaelan lunged, his massive body moving to intercept the glass. Alpha Garrick roared, swinging his broadsword to deflect the projectiles. But Seraphina was already moving. The mother's protective fury overrode every physical limitation of her body. She did not wait for the Alpha King to save her. She did not hide behind the Northern Warlord. She stepped directly into the path of the flying poison, her storm-glass eyes widening as the dormant, god-tier magic in her blood finally violently detonated. The ambient moisture in the room flash-froze in a fraction of a second. A localized shockwave of pure, 0-degree atmospheric pressure exploded from Seraphina's sternum. It expanded outward in a perfect, crystalline dome of blinding white energy. The physical temperature in the clinic plummeted so fast that the heavy oak roof beams groaned in protest, and the moisture on the windows turned into thick sheets of opaque ice. The flying glass vials hit the invisible wall of absolute cold and instantly stopped in mid-air. The lethal liquid inside them froze solid, suspended like deadly jewels in the frozen air. A heartbeat later, the concentrated magic pulsed again, a ripple of raw, ancient power, and the frozen vials shattered into millions of harmless, glittering dust particles that drifted slowly to the floorboards like fine snow. The rogue mercenaries charging through the door slammed into the expanding shockwave. Their poisoned silver weapons instantly became so cold that the metal turned brittle. As the assassins attempted to swing their blades, the steel literally shattered into jagged, useless pieces in their hands. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of the magic forced the breath from their lungs. The hardened mercenaries dropped to their knees in paralyzed, freezing terror, their bodies completely immobilized by the ancient power radiating from the true Luna of Valdris. Lady Victoria hit the magical barrier and was thrown backward violently. She crashed onto the wooden floorboards, her crimson dress tangling around her legs. Seraphina did not stop. She walked slowly forward, her boots crunching softly over the glittering, shattered remains of the poison. Her icy stare, which had once held oceans of devotion for the man kneeling before her, was completely terrifyingly still. The ambient temperature dropped another 10 degrees with every deliberate step she took. Lady Victoria, sprawled on the wooden floorboards, tried to scramble backward, but the moisture in her lavish crimson gown had already frozen to the wood, anchoring her in place. The manipulator's lips were blue, her teeth chattering in uncontrollable, primal terror as the sheer atmospheric pressure of the true Luna's aura crushed the oxygen from her lungs. Seraphina stopped inches from the treacherous noble. She did not yell. She did not bare her teeth. She simply looked down at the woman who had stolen her crown, poisoned her mate, and tried to murder her child. "You wanted the Winter Throne, Lady Victoria," Serafina whispered. The voice was quiet, but it resonated through the frozen room with the unyielding finality of a falling avalanche. "Have it." Sarah raised her hand. A pulse of concentrated glacial magic shot from her fingertips, encasing Lady Victoria in a solid, unmoving block of opaque ice from the neck down. The antagonist gasped, her eyes wide, completely paralyzed within her self-made frozen tomb. The remaining mercenaries, witnessing the undeniable power of the true Luna fully unleashed, didn't need further convincing. They pressed their faces against the frozen floorboards, weeping and choking out desperate pleas for mercy, utterly subjugated by the wild sovereign of the ice. Behind her, Alpha Garrick slowly lowered his broadsword. The massive ruler of the Frostborn domain did not gloat. He let out a low breath of absolute reverence, stepping back into the shadows of the clinic. He recognized the truth. Serafina Vance had never needed his protection. She had simply been waiting in silence, and King Cailan, the most feared warlord of the Southern Empire, could no longer stand. The broadsword slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the ice-covered floor. The physical sight of her power, combined with the crushing realization of her survival and the sheer, breathtaking dignity she possessed, completely broke the last remaining defenses of his pride. His heavy armored knees hit the floorboards with a dull thud. The Alpha King lowered his head. He did not look at Alpha Garrick. He did not look at the frozen ruin of Lady Victoria's schemes. He only looked at the hem of Serafina's woven wool skirt. The sun-blooded ring on his right hand flared with blinding, molten amber fire, recognizing the absolute authority of the woman standing before him. Tears, hot and searing, finally spilled over King Cailan's scarred cheeks, freezing the moment they hit the icy air. The grovel was complete, profound, and absolute. With trembling fingers, he reached for his right hand. He slowly slid the ancient heirloom from his own finger. The ancient band hummed with warmth as he lifted his open palm, offering the blazing symbol of the Valdris throne to the only woman who had ever been worthy to wear it. "I am sorry," King Cailan rasped, his voice shattering under the immense, crushing weight of his colossal regret as he held the ring up to her. "I am so sorry, my Luna." The clinic fell into absolute silence. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter outside, broken only by the crackle of dying embers and the ragged sound of a broken king begging for salvation. The silence in the clinic was a physical weight. It pressed down on the shattered floorboards, heavy with the stench of melted ice, broken glass, and the overwhelming, suffocating despair radiating from the Alpha King of Valdris. King Cailan remained on his knees. The towering warlord, a man who had commanded armies and broken rebellions with a single snarl, was now entirely broken. His broad shoulders shook. The tears that spilled from his blazing golden eyes did not simply fall. They hit the supernatural frost covering the wooden floor and instantly crystallized, turning into tiny, jagged diamonds of ice. He held his right hand out. Sitting on his scarred, trembling palm was the fabled ceremonial band. The ancestral band of white gold and raw amber was pulsing with a frantic, blinding heat, desperately reacting to the proximity of the true Luna. It cast a flickering, molten glow across Cailan's gaunt face, highlighting the deep hollows beneath his cheekbones and the dark circles of a man who had not known a single night of peace in half a decade. The heat radiating from the amber clashed violently with the freezing air, sending wisps of steam coiling around his fingers. "Please," King Cailan whispered. The word tore through the quiet room, raw and bleeding. He was not commanding her. He was not the sovereign of the Southern Empire, demanding the return of his property. He was a starving man begging for a single drop of water in an endless desert. The lunar elixir. It was a shroud over my mind, Sarah. It suffocated my inner beast. It masked your scent and twisted my reality until I could not tell my own thoughts from the poison she poured into my cup. I didn't know. I swear to the goddess, I did not know. Serafina Vance looked down at him. She did not step forward. She did not reach out to accept the blazing ring. Her storm-glass eyes, locking onto his broken golden stare, were completely, terrifyingly still. She analyzed his physical state. She registered the frantic, uneven hammering of his heart, a staccato rhythm of absolute devastation. She smelled the bitter, decaying scent of stale ozone and regret pouring from his pores. She saw the phantom golden thread of their mate bond, a shimmering, ethereal tether, frantically extending from his chest, reaching out like desperate, burning fingers trying to latch back onto her soul. But the moment the golden thread touched the edges of her aura, it hit a wall of absolute, unyielding ice. The tether recoiled, sparking and fizzling in the cold air, unable to penetrate the fortress she had built around her heart. The physiological reaction that should have driven her to her knees in relief, the urge to comfort her distressed mate, to soothe his pain, to bury her face in his neck and inhale his scent, simply did not exist. The inner wolf that had once howled for Cailan Drake was gone, replaced by the silent, ancient sovereign of the frost that had awakened to protect her son. "You didn't know," Seraphina repeated. Her voice was not loud, yet it resonated with a calm, atmospheric pressure that made the remaining mercenaries on the floor flinch. "You didn't know about the poison. You didn't know about the conspiracy." She took a single, slow step forward. The sound of the ice snapping under her woven wool boots was the only response the king received for a long moment, stretching his agony into infinity. "But you knew how to draft a royal decree," she continued, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by several degrees. "You knew how to sit in your study, completely sober to the political reality of your court, and calculate my exact value. You knew how to declare me a temporary measure, a placeholder. You knew how to sign a parchment that traded my life for an alliance." King Cailan flinched violently, as if she had driven a physical blade between his ribs. His armored chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen. "It was the poison speaking, it was her manipulation." "No," Seraphina interrupted, her voice slicing through his defense like a razor through silk. She kept her spine perfectly straight. "Magic can cloud a mind, King Cailan. A potion can mask a scent. But a true fated mate's soul does not surrender so easily. If your devotion had been absolute, your inner beast would have torn that study apart before allowing you to promise the Luna's throne to another woman. The poison only exploited the doubt that was already there. You looked at me, and you saw weakness. You saw a barren Omega who could not secure your legacy." She gestured slightly to the back of the room, where Healer Nora was standing quietly, keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. Beside Seraphina, Lucius stood half-hidden behind her skirts. The 5-year-old boy gripped the fabric of his mother's dress, his small jaw set, mirroring his mother's stoicism. Tiny sparks of frost formed on his fingertips, his molten gold eyes staring intensely at the weeping giant on the floor. "And now you look at him," Seraphina said, her voice softening slightly as she rested a protective hand on her son's dark hair. "You look at Luca, and you suddenly understand the catastrophic cost of your blindness. You want the heir you thought you could never have. You want the cure for the rot eating away at Valdris. You want the warmth to return to your frozen castle. I want you," Cailan choked out, his voice cracking entirely. He crawled forward a single inch, his heavy armor scraping against the frost. "I want my wife. I want the only woman I have ever loved. I will execute every member of the council who stood against you. I will burn the Valdris fortress to the ground and build you a new one from the ashes. Just, please, accept the ring. Come home." Seraphina looked at the heavy, blazing circle sitting on his palm. The amber core was a swirling vortex of ancient magic, a physical manifestation of the Empire's supreme power. 5 years ago she had worn it with pride. 5 years ago removing it had felt like scraping her own bone. Now it just looked like a heavy piece of metal. Because begging would not have changed the outcome 5 years ago, and kneeling does not change it today, Seraphina stated with absolute, unshakable finality. The words struck the Alpha King with lethal precision. His outstretched hand began to shake uncontrollably. "I am not a placeholder, King Cailan," she continued, her piercing gaze locking onto his broken golden stare. "I will not return to a throne that was promised to a traitor. I will not wear a band that you were prepared to place on Lady Victoria's finger. You told me once that I was not used, not owned, but chosen. That was a lie. You discarded me the moment I became politically inconvenient. I survived the blizzard you cast me into. I survived the starvation, the isolation, and the terror of raising a royal heir in the shadows. I healed my own wounds. She took a deliberate step back, severing the physical proximity. I am no longer your Luna, Seraphina declared to the room, her voice carrying the absolute authority of an ancient bloodline decree. I do not belong to the Southern Empire. I belong to the winter. I belong to the ice, and I belong to myself. King Kaelin let out a sound that was barely human. It was the agonizing, prolonged death rattle of a soul realizing it had been permanently exiled. The physical realization of her rejection crashed down upon him, crushing the last microscopic fragment of his hope into dust. The golden thread of the mate bond, which had been thrashing desperately in the air between them, suddenly went completely rigid. Then, with a soundless, psychic snap, the glowing tether dissolved into ash and vanished. The bond was dead. Not severed by distance or misunderstanding, but permanently rejected by the sovereign will of the true Luna. Kaelin's head dropped, his forehead hit the frozen floorboards. The mighty Alpha King of Valdris wept in front of the rogue mercenaries, in front of healer Nora, and in front of his greatest rival. He wept until his throat bled, mourning the irreversible destruction of his own destiny. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted further, not from Seraphina's magic, but from the sudden, catastrophic death of the sunfire within Kaelin's own spirit. He clutched his chest, gasping as the phantom pain of a severed soul ripped through his biology. Behind Seraphina, Alpha Garrick Thorn remained silent. The massive ruler of the northern domain did not gloat. He did not step forward to claim victory over his broken enemy. He simply watched Seraphina with a gaze of profound, absolute reverence. He had offered her sanctuary, believing her to be a fragile refugee. Instead, he was standing in the presence of a queen who had just executed a tyrant, using nothing but the quiet dignity of her own self-worth. "Gather your guards," Seraphina commanded softly, looking down at the weeping king. "Remove the frozen block of treason that was once your chosen bride. Leave the Ashenir borders, and do not ever return." "My son," Kaelin rasped, his voice a broken, hollow whisper against the wood. Let me be a father to him." Seraphina looked down at Lucius. The boy did not step toward Kaelin. He pressed closer to his mother's leg, the primal instincts of his young wolf, recognizing the man on the floor not as a protector, but as a source of immense, chaotic pain. "Lucius is a prince of the snow," Seraphina replied, her tone fiercely protective. "He will be raised here, in the light of the truth, where a word is an unbreakable bond. When he is old enough, he will make his own choices. But you will not drag him back into the rotting political cage of Valdris. Go back to your decaying castle, Kaelin. Rule over the ashes you created." It took King Kaelin 5 agonizing minutes to force his body to obey. The physical effort required to push himself up from the floorboards made his massive muscles tremble with exhaustion. He looked like a walking corpse, a hollow suit of armor animated only by a curse of eternal regret. He slowly closed his fist around the heavy metal. The amber core of the band, sensing the permanent severing of the bond, instantly went cold, turning back into a dull, lifeless grey stone. He did not look at her again. The shame was too absolute, the devastation too complete. Kaelin turned and walked out of the shattered clinic door. His surviving elite guards silently dragged the heavy, frozen block containing Lady Victoria out into the snow, their heads bowed in absolute submission to the atmospheric terror Seraphina had unleashed. The howling blizzard swallowed the Valdris king, erasing his massive silhouette into the endless white void. When the last of them was gone, the crushing tension in the room finally began to dissipate. The supernatural frost covering the walls slowly began to melt, turning into harmless droplets of water that dripped quietly onto the floor. Seraphina let out a long, slow breath. The violent adrenaline that had fueled her ancient magic receded, leaving her physically exhausted, but spiritually lighter than she had felt in 5 years. The hollow ache in her chest, the phantom pain of the broken mate bond that had haunted her every waking moment was completely gone. In its place was a profound, unshakable peace. Alpha Garrick finally stepped forward, his heavy boots sounding loud in the quiet room. He stopped a respectful distance away from her. The imposing warlord, a man who bowed to absolutely no one, slowly sank to one knee, lowering his head in absolute fealty. The North recognizes its true sovereign. Alpha Garrick rumbled, his voice vibrating with unwavering loyalty. My armies, my territories, and my life are at your disposal, Alpha Queen. You have cleansed this land of poison, and you have proven that true power does not roar. It waits. Seraphina looked at the kneeling warlord. She did not ask him to rise immediately. She accepted the heavy, monumental shift in her reality. She was no longer an exile. She was no longer a hidden rogue. She was the absolute ruler of her own destiny. Rise, Garrick, she said softly. We have an empire to build from the ice. Time in the Ashenir Pack did not pass. It crystallized. 3 years later, the jagged peaks of the borderlands had been completely transformed. The scattered rogue settlements, the isolated villages, and the heavy military encampments of the Northern Coalition had unified into a singular, sprawling empire of snow and steel. The Northern Sanctuary of Ashenir was a kingdom built not on the oppressive political machinations of nobility, but on the unyielding principles of survival, loyalty, and absolute merit. The coronation ceremony took place on the eve of the winter solstice, precisely 8 years after the night. Seraphina's world had shattered in the southern fortress. The architecture of the new northern capital was breathtaking. It was a massive amphitheater carved directly into the heart of a millennial glacier. The walls of sheer, polished ice reflected the brilliant, cascading light of the aurora borealis overhead, painting the night sky in vibrant ribbons of emerald, violet, and deep sapphire. Thousands of wolves stood in perfect, disciplined formation across the expansive, frozen courtyard. There was no chaotic shouting, no drunken revelry. There was only a profound, heavy silence of absolute respect. They could smell the clean, sharp scent of pine and ozone radiating from their new Luna, a scent that signified absolute protection. Seraphina Vance walked down the central aisle of clear ice. She was a vision of terrifying, awe-inspiring sovereignty. The simple woven wool of her exile had been replaced by a magnificent gown of spun silver threads and heavy, pristine white direwolf furs. The fabric trailed behind her, shimmering like the surface of a frozen river under the pale moon. Her silver-white hair was left unbound, cascading down her back, catching the ambient light of the auroras. Every step she took resonated with the dormant magic of her bloodline, solidifying the ice beneath her boots, ensuring she would never slip, never falter. She did not walk behind a king. She walked alone, her spine perfectly straight, her storm-glass grey eyes scanning the massive crowd with the serene, unshakable calm of a deity. The physical temperature around her was freezing, yet it was not oppressive. It was a cleansing, invigorating cold that filled the lungs of her people with strength and clarity. At the end of the aisle stood a massive throne carved from a single unbroken block of dark sapphire ice. Waiting for her at the base of the dais was Alpha Garrick Thorn. He wore the heavy, spiked armor of his warlord lineage, but his stance was not that of a ruler. It was the stance of an equal, a staunch brother-in-arms who had spent the last 3 years fighting shoulder to shoulder with her to secure their borders and crush any remaining rogue threats. He offered her his forearm, a warrior's greeting. Seraphina clasped his forearm, the leather of his gauntlet creaking under her firm grip. They exchanged a look of absolute mutual respect. There was no romance between them, no forced political marriage. There was only the unbreakable bond of chosen family and shared survival. The warmth of his steady pulse against her wrist was a testament to the safety she had found in the barren north. Standing proudly beside the sapphire throne was Lucius. At 8 years old, the Prince of the Snow was already displaying the terrifying potential of his blended lineage. He was tall, his broad shoulders hinting at the massive alpha he would one day become. He wore a dark fur cloak fastened with a silver clasp shaped like a howling wolf. His molten gold eyes, bright and piercing, tracked his mother's every movement with fierce, unapologetic adoration. A massive, pure white snow wolf pup, a feral beast that had instinctively submitted to the boy's aura, sat obediently at his feet, its head settled on Luca's boot. Lucius was thriving. He was not a hidden secret, forced to suppress his nature in the shadows. He was being trained by Garrick in the brutal arts of northern warfare, and guided by Seraphina in the quiet, terrifying control of atmospheric magic. He was loved, protected, and completely free. The traumatic encounter with his biological father at the clinic had faded into a distant memory, replaced by the secure, unwavering presence of the wolves who had chosen to stand by his mother's side. Healer Nora, now elevated to the position of High Oracle of the Northern Court, stepped forward. Her weathered hands held a cushion of dark velvet. Lying on the velvet was the Northern Crown. It was not a delicate circlet of southern starlight steel. It was a heavy, imposing masterpiece forged from northern ice, black iron, and raw, uncut diamonds that gleamed with internal cold fire. It was a crown designed for a ruler who understood the weight of survival. Seraphina turned to face her people. The thousands of wolves in the glacial amphitheater held their breath. Nora lifted the heavy crown and placed it gently, firmly onto Seraphina's head. The moment the cold iron touched her brow, a massive, localized shockwave of pure, zero-degree magic pulsed outward from her sternum. It swept across the amphitheater, a physical wave of absolute authority that ruffled the furs of every wolf present. The air shimmered with floating ice crystals, catching the emerald light of the auroras. The magic seeped into the glacial walls, fortifying them, making the sanctuary entirely impenetrable to any southern magic. Without a single command being spoken, the entire population of the Ashenir pack dropped to one knee. The synchronized sound of thousands of boots hitting the ice echoed like a thunderclap against the glacier walls. Alpha Garrick knelt beside her. Lucius bowed his head in deep reverence. Seraphina looked out over her empire. The hollow ache of betrayal was a distant, irrelevant memory. She had forged a kingdom from her own suffering, transforming the bitter cold of her exile into a fortress of unbreakable power. Hundreds of miles to the south, a drastically different reality played out in the suffocating darkness of Valdris. The southern winter fortress was a dying tomb. The heavy stone walls were crumbling, choked by creeping vines of dead, black ivy. The grand banquet halls, once filled with laughter and the clinking of goblets, were silent, filled only with the scurrying of rats and the freezing draughts that leaked through the cracked windows. The pack numbers had dwindled to a fraction of their former glory. Without the stabilizing presence of a true Luna, the primal magic of the territory had completely rotted away, leaving the soil barren and the wolves aggressive and paranoid. The very air inside the castle smelled of decay and stale iron. King Kaelan sat motionless on the obsidian throne in the pitch-black room. He had not ordered the hearths to be lit in 3 years. The darkness was absolute, mirroring the catastrophic void inside his own chest. His massive frame had withered, his heavy armor hanging loosely over his gaunt, starving body. His hair was matted, his once devastatingly handsome face heavily lined with the brutal architecture of permanent, incurable grief. The physical symptoms of a rejected mate bond had ravaged his biology. His heart beat at a fraction of its normal pace, barely keeping his vital organs functioning. He raised his right hand, the movement slow and mechanical. He stared his finger. A heavy, dead circle of white gold rested there. The amber core was dull, opaque, and freezing to the touch. It would never glow again. The ancient magic of his ancestors had abandoned him the moment he allowed his pride and his blindness to drive away the only soul capable of sustaining it. The punishment for his betrayal was not a swift death in battle. It was this. It was the agonizing, prolonged decay of a hollow king ruling over nothing but cold ashes. Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight. She stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy. She will never step aside again. Let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did King Kaelan's agonizing regret satisfy your need for justice, or did he deserve his frozen fate? Subscribe and join our pack for more stories of quiet strength, ancient magic, and absolute devotion.